Institute, located in Kennedy Meadows, California. He has a PhD in ecology with a research focus on fire ecology in conifer forest ecosystems. He is also a board member of the Sierra Club. Dr. Hanson has published dozens of peer-reviewed studies on forest and fire ecology. He is the author of Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. He is also the author and co-editor and co-author of the 2015 book, The Ecological Importance of Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix. On that one, he's the co-editor and co-author. Dr. Hanson joined the Sierra Club after hiking the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada in 1989 with his older brother, and seeing firsthand the devastation caused by commercial logging on our national forests. The New York Times in 2017 described Dr. Hanson as being on the cutting edge of ecological research. With that, I will bring you Chad Hanson, and Chad, feel free to take the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Karen and Kristen, for that nice introduction. Really appreciate that. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Hanson. I'm going to talk about giant sequoias and wildfire tonight. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully that goes just fine. All right. So let me know if that comes through okay. Are folks okay. Good. All right. So I'm going to be talking specifically about giant sequoias and fire, and in particular, high intensity fire patches. Now, we have all heard recently that fire is a threat to giant sequoias, and somehow that rolling back environmental laws or circumventing them through emergency exemptions and doing a bunch of logging and tree cutting projects, that's
Chet.
okay. Sorry, am I muted?
You were for 2 seconds.
Okay,
but you're not now.
2 seconds is fine. All right, everyone can hear me okay now? Thumbs up if you can. All right, thank you. Okay, so all right, I'm going to be focusing on this because there's a massive disconnect between the research, especially the field research that my colleagues and I are gathering in these sequoia groves that burned in recent years, versus the kind of public and political narrative that's being used and I would argue weaponized out there to promote destructive logging projects in the sequoia groves and to promote destructive logging bills like the so-called Save Our Sequoias Act.
Chad, I want to mute everybody and then I'll unmute you. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Just a second. Sorry.
No problem.
Okay. Please go unmute yourself and go.
All right. Am I coming through okay now?
Yes.
All right. Sounds good. So this is a picture I took at 4 years post-fire in the Nelder Grove. This is a giant sequoia grove on Sierra National Forest, just south of Yosemite National Park. And this was a mixed intensity fire called the Railroad Fire that burned in 2017, mostly low and moderate intensity, but there were some high intensity fire patches. This was one of them. And of course, the narrative that we hear again and again is that if it burns at high intensity, the sequoias can't regenerate. Well, what we're actually seeing here is abundant, vigorous, tremendous giant sequoia reproduction 4 years after the railroad fire in this high intensity fire patch in the Nelder Grove. All that, what you can see there, those are all giant sequoia seedlings and saplings, mostly saplings at this point in time. A lot of those were 3 to 4 feet tall at that point in time. Some of them were as much as 5 feet tall. There's some shrubs and some other vegetation as well, but most of that's sequoia seedlings. All right. Clearly no problem with regeneration. Now this picture my colleague Bryant Baker, who's part of our research team in the Nelder Grove. He took this picture in June of 2023 at 6 years post-fire in the high-intensity fire patch. And now these giant sequoias that are naturally regenerating there abundantly.
Well, you go ahead. You want to watch it. It's important for you.
They are more like 6 to 8 feet tall, and in some cases over 12 feet tall. And that is just a tremendous regeneration in just a short period of time after the fire. And this is 4 of the 5 members of our research team here, Tanya Chi, Maya Khosla, myself, and Bryant Baker. Dr. Michael Dorsey was not able to join on this particular field outing, but you can see, we're standing amidst this amazing, young sequoia forest that's naturally regenerating. And this is completely contrary to the political narrative being spun by politicians who are promoting the logging bill deceptively named the Save Our Sequoias Act, as well as by Forest Service managers that are promoting these logging projects and tree planting projects through emergency exemptions and circumventing environmental laws. Now, just to put in perspective, because someone could say, well, they're regenerating great in these high intensity patches. Well, maybe they're also regenerating wonderfully in the low intensity fire areas. Well, they're really not. This is 2 low intensity areas in the Nelder Grove, just creeping surface fire areas, which was, predominantly what happened in this fire. But what you can see is there's just very little regeneration of anything, some grasses, some forbs, but no sequoia seedlings here. Now, this is not to say that you won't get any sequoia seedlings in low intensity fire areas. You do sometimes. You get more in moderate than low, not as much as high, but you will get some. But in the true low intensity fire areas, you either get no regeneration whatsoever, or you get a significant amount of regeneration initially, a bunch of seedlings, and then it dies very quickly within a few years after the fire, because it just doesn't have the conditions it needs to thrive and survive in the post-fire landscape. And I'll explain that in a minute. So more examples here. This is in the Sequoia and Kings Canyon Wilderness area in the Redwood Mountain Grove, Kings Canyon National Park. I took this picture in June of 2023. This was just 2 years post-fire. You can see all the amazing sequoia seedlings already regenerating, just beautiful regeneration. This is deep in the high-intensity fire patch. There was it was mostly low and moderate intensity once again, but there was one larger high-intensity fire patch in the southern part of the grove. And the Park Service assumed that there would be little or no sequoia regeneration, and they proposed and are implementing a tree plantation project, including tree cutting for helicopter landings with chainsaws and explosives in this wilderness area, supposedly to reforest based on the narrative that sequoias are not naturally regenerating. But this is actually what's happening in the Redwood Mountain Grove in the high-intensity fire patch. This is typical. More sequoia regeneration. This is typical too. This is about 300 meters inside the large high-intensity fire patch. And you can see there's certainly no lack of sequoia seedlings. There are over 50,000 per acre in this area. That is not uncommon. On average, we were finding around 20 to 25,000 per acre, 15,000, 10,000, some places over 100,000 per acre. Very common. Very few places had low levels of regeneration. There were some areas that had dozens or a few hundred. It's a very small percentage, but they're still regenerating great, very high survival. They're growing wonderfully. And again, another area deep in the high intensity fire patch. Look at that. It's like a carpet. It's like a sea of sequoia seedlings. There are so many that you actually have to be careful how and where you walk. You can't just walk in a straight line. You'll step on them and you potentially crush them. And so if you care about giant sequoias, there are so many, it's so abundant, the regeneration, where the Park Service is falsely and dishonestly telling the public that there's a lack of regeneration. There's so many that they literally can't walk through there without risking stepping on them. This is my friend and colleague, Ara Martirosyan, Sequoia forest keeper and also longtime Sierra Club volunteer leader. I took this picture in the Redwood Mountain Grove in the high intensity fire patch in late September of last year. So just a few months later than the photos I just showed you. And look at how much taller the sequoia seedlings are. They're already basically thigh and waist high in places, and just tremendous growth just in a few months. And that's really what's going on out there. And this is me. I'm standing there pointing up the slope. That's my friend and colleague Gary Lasky there, Tehipity chapter with the orange hard hat. And then with the white hard hat, that's the superintendent of Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. And he had not been there. And we hiked him deep into the large high intensity fire patch where they were proposing this tree plantation project based on what he had been told, that there was a lack or little or no sequoia regeneration. And you can see we were walking through a sea of sequoia seedlings, some ferns, some shrubs too, but mostly sequoia seedlings. And, just like us, he had to be careful where he was stepping, just stepping to the left, stepping to the right, balancing on one leg to not step on sequoia seedlings. And he, in my opinion, seemed a little embarrassed and said, well, obviously we shouldn't be planting in areas with this much sequoia regeneration. Problem is, from in terms of the project proposal and their narrative, is that this is common, this is typical in the high intensity fire patch, and you have to actually search to find areas that don't have nearly as much. And they ignored what the evidence. They ignored even their promise to us that they would not plant in areas like this, and went ahead and planted anyway. And we are in court with them, with a number of other organizations to try to stop that. So here are some of the lessons emerging from our field research in the Nelder Grove, in the Redwood Mountain Grove, and we're seeing this in other sequoia groves that have burned recently too. Sequoia reproduction is the most abundant in the high intensity fire patches. And it's a big difference relative, especially to low intensity. Sequoia seedlings have by far the highest survival rates in the high intensity fire patches compared to low intensity. In fact, in the high intensity fire patches, sequoia seedlings have survival rates that are about 10 times higher than they are in the low intensity patches. Sequoia seedlings and saplings are growing much faster and taller in the high intensity patches relative to the low intensity. The difference is like fivefold, or more. It's pretty tremendous. And sequoia seedlings and saplings are by far the most dominant in the high intensity fire patches relative to other conifer species like white fir, incense cedar, Jeffrey pine, etc. And so all these things tell us that this is a species that has a long evolutionary history with high intensity fire, and actually has a competitive advantage over other conifer species when high intensity fire occurs. It benefits from high intensity fire, and its reproduction, its life cycle, is inextricably linked with high intensity fire. And in fact, giant sequoias are one of hundreds of tree species around the world that have evolved this very, very special relationship with high intensity fire over the course of tens of millions of years in terms of their reproduction and their cycle of reproduction, their life cycle. And we call those serotinous species. And this is what it means, basically. For giant sequoias, the question is, well, why do they respond to high intensity fire in this way? As I mentioned, giant sequoias are serotinous. And so the number of things are associated with that, with this species. They require high levels of heat to open cones and release seeds. And so fire does that, but not just creeping surface fire. That doesn't really do it. You need fire with sufficient intensity and heat generation to cause the cones to release their seeds. Number two, you need 100% consumption of the thick duff and litter on the forest floor. And what that does is it not only allows the sequoia seedlings to sink their roots into soil, as opposed to duff and litter. But also it turns that duff and litter into a nutrient-rich bed of mineral ash that helps and spurs the growth of those sequoia seedlings and saplings and young sequoias for decades to come. And the last thing is they need mortality of most or all of the tree canopy in these patches. It can be a small patch, it can be a big patch. As long as those high intensity patches occur and they kill most or all the canopy trees, then the sequoia seedlings have what they need to grow and establish and thrive and survive over the years. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the mythology that's been going on. I'm sure you've all heard in the news over and over and over again, government scientists and government agency managers claiming, and politicians claiming that 20% of all mature sequoias in existence were killed in the 2020 and 2021 fires. And this is amazing. This got repeated so much because it doesn't come from any published peer-reviewed data. It comes from kind of a back of the cocktail napkin rough assessment based on very preliminary data, anecdotal data, not gathered with scientific protocols, and opportunistically selected and not unbiased. And based on that, they made these projections. But first of all, they were again, the data set appears to be significantly biased, but also they didn't take into account things like epicormic branching, which is another adaptation giant sequoias have, that they've evolved over tens of millions of years. Giant sequoias can look dead after fire. You can stand on the ground and you can't see a single green bit of green foliage at the top of the crown. But a couple of years later, in many cases, you will see new green foliage at the top of the crown that sequoia is producing. The sequoia looked dead, but it's not dead. And this is not to say that high intensity fire cannot kill mature sequoias. It can and does, and has been doing so for millions and millions of years, tens of millions of years. That is natural. It's part of the life cycle. But you will always find quite a few surviving mature sequoias scattered throughout these high-intensity fire patches. Even deep in the interior of the largest high-intensity fire patches, you will find plenty of surviving mature sequoias. And what they do is they basically recreate their green crown structure over the years after the fire, kind of like the proverbial lizard regrowing its tail. And if you look closely at this picture, which I took in the Redwood Mountain Grove at 2 years post-fire, you can see that green crown developing there. That's all new green foliage developing after the fire. So I did a much more comprehensive analysis using satellite imagery, using the Forest Service's and Park Service's own data in terms of where these sequoias are, and the post-fire imagery. And I, based on an unbiased analysis with a much larger data set, I estimated that only about 8% of mature sequoias have been killed in recent fires, not 20%, as has been falsely claimed. Now, 8% is I think probably very much in line with what's been happening for many, many centuries, many millennia with this species. It is an ecological fact that this species has evolved to depend on high intensity fire for reproduction. High intensity fire will kill a certain portion of the mature sequoias in those high intensity fire patches. But of course, the fires are mostly low and moderate intensity.
Uh-oh.
About sequoias and fire. A lot of it is done cynically. I think they've been corrected. The proponents of the bill have been corrected on the facts. They continue to spin these myths, so we know it's not innocent. One of the myths is they claim that they claim that low intensity fire is what giant sequoias need, and so they are trying to impose through tree cutting, through logging, through low intensity prescribed burning. They're trying to impose a homogeneous low intensity surface fire regime in these sequoia groves. Now, that's not going to work. It's just going to cause a lot of damage to the groves. But to the extent that they are able to try to exclude higher intensity fire in these groves, that's basically an extinction strategy for this species. Sequoias will not survive long-term with just homogeneous low intensity surface fire. It just does not give them what they need to successfully reproduce. Now, bear in mind, we have been until 2015, until the series of natural lightning fires, the rough fire, in 2015, the Castle Fire in 2020, the KMP complex and the Windy Fire in 2021, and some others. A series of natural lightning fires that have burned most of the grove, Sequoia Grove areas in existence since 2015. Before that, for about 120 years, we had been successfully keeping wildfires out of the Sequoia groves, with some very few exceptions. And the groves have been slow with little fanfare and have not been replacing themselves. All that changed after 2015, and now we have this tremendous, wonderful, abundant reproduction of giant sequoias in these areas where fire occurred at the high end of moderate intensity all the way up to the highest end of high intensity. That's where the reproduction is happening and where it's growing so wonderfully. And we're seeing the best reproduction of giant sequoias that any human being has seen since the late 1800s right now because of these fires. The big threat, of course, are these logging projects and these dangerous logging bills that would actually just roll back environmental laws, cut the public out of the process, eliminate environmental analysis, and go in with chainsaws and bulldozers and tree planting crews and basically create an industrial forestry landscape and kill in the process most of the natural regeneration that's happening. And so the proponents of the act have exaggerated mature sequoia mortality, as I mentioned. They have falsely represented the natural fire regime in sequoia groves and what sequoias need to reproduce. And on top of that, they have proposed to gut the Wilderness Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act to allow lawless logging of any type in these sequoia groves in wilderness areas, in national parks and national forests, under the guise of restoration and reforestation. Don't believe it, it's a lie. So I'm going to show you just briefly before we go to question and answer. I'm going to show you some examples of what it means when the proponents of the so-called Save Our Sequoias Act and when Forest Service land managers use words like restoration and reforestation. This is what it really looks like. This is logging project, post-fire logging in the Nelder Grove on Sierra National Forest. We're in court over this too right now, joined by a number of allies, including Sierra Club, and challenging this logging project, which the Forest Service just used a rare and inappropriate emergency exemption from NEPA, and went ahead, and you see this giant logging slash pile and a crushed and killed sequoia sapling, which the logging machinery rolled over and killed. And we're seeing this over and over and over again in the places that they've logged. They're killing most of the young sequoia forest that was naturally regenerating after the fire. More crushed and killed sequoia seedlings in this post-fire logging project in the Nelder Grove under the guise of restoration and reforestation. Again, this is just a logging project. They're removing live mature trees. They are clear-cutting ecologically important snags. They're using ground-based logging machinery and rolling over and crushing and killing the sequoia forest that's naturally regenerating. Another sequoia seedling crushed and killed in logging slash debris pile in the Nelder Grove, and yet another and another. And these photos go on and on and on in the places where logging has happened. Not all the logging has been completed. We hope to stop the remainder of it, but in the places where logging has happened, this is what it looks like. This is on the edge of the sequoia grove. This is in the sequoia grove. There are sequoia seedlings that were crushed and killed in this area. And so this is what's happening. And this is what the Forest Service is calling restoration and reforestation. Again, don't believe it. They're logging for lumber and they're logging for biomass energy. A lot of the snags and the shrubs, and even we're even seeing sequoia seedlings and saplings cut and uprooted and piled in these piles, waiting to be chipped and hauled to the biomass plants. We're calling this clear cuts for kilowatts, and it is a travesty, and it should not happen anywhere, and especially in an area that's supposed to be protected in the sequoia grove on public lands with taxpayer money. Another photo showing what it really means when the Forest Service uses the term restoration or reforestation. So we need to peer beyond these euphemisms and these deceptions. see through the smoke screen and see what's really happening. This is a part of the grove where the 2017 fire did not burn. It's a portion, about 20% or so, did not burn in the 2017 fire. And the Forest Service, as part of the same project, went in and did what they were claiming would be light touch thinning. When people hear that term, they think of Forest Service folks out there in their Forest Service greens with pruning shears, maybe cutting some seedlings, some saplings, maybe the odd shrub here and there. No, these are industrial logging projects, and they're doing this, again, under the guise of fire management and restoration. And you can see they're leaving these giant, bonfire-like piles out there of logging slash. So if you want more information on forest and fire ecology generally, and I talk about sequoias and fire a little bit here too, but just a broader, take on forest and fire ecology and the mismanagement by the Forest Service, you check out my book, Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you again, Chad, for another fantastic talk. And I can personally vouch for the fact that Smokescreen is a phenomenal read. And if you haven't read it, go out and buy it right after this talk is over. So we have a number of questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible. I apologize if we can't. Chad, before I go ahead, can I ask you if you had a hard stop time-wise, or what would you be willing to go to?
Well, let's just get into it. I don't have a particular hard stop, and so I'm always happy to answer questions. So let's see how far we can get.
Okay, all right. So to jump right into it, why does Forest Service promote logging in sequoia groves?
Yeah, good question. It's one of these things where the simplest answer is, usually the correct one. This is the case here. It's about the money. The Forest Service is not doing this to help the sequoia groves. These are logging projects, and the agency is clever. These are not dumb people. They understand that if they use the term logging or timber sale or timber harvest, that the public doesn't want that on public lands, and they certainly don't want to be paying for it with taxpayer money. So the Forest Service does the same logging that they were doing in the 1980s and 1990s, and instead they call it restoration, reforestation, forest health, wildfire management, fuel reduction. You've all heard these euphemisms. There's a whole series of them, but it's the same logging we saw, again and again for many, many decades. Clear cuts, logging mature trees, ground, tractor logging, destroying regeneration. These are not light touch operations. And so it really is about the money. Bear in mind, these sequoia groves are some of the most carbon rich forest ecosystems on the face of the planet. What that also means from a logging industry perspective is that they're some of the most timber rich. They have some of the highest levels of board feet per acre from a logging perspective. And the logging industry wants that. And the more the Forest Service sells to logging companies, the more money the agency keeps for its budget. When it comes to post-fire logging, the Forest Service keeps 100% of the revenue for its budget, instead of that money going to the general fund of the U.S. Treasury, into taxpayers' pockets. And so the agency is under a series of perverse incentives to do these logging projects and to be dishonest about it with the public. Now, bear in mind, the laws, those corrupt laws, were passed by Congress, and they need to be repealed and undone by Congress. So the buck stops with them at the end of the day. Forest Service is doing the wrong thing, but they're also operating under a corrupt system that Congress created, and so we really need to put pressure on Congress to change that and protect these forests.
Okay. Moving on. Are snags or burned trees a fire hazard capes of returning?
Yeah, really good question. No, it's interesting. This has been studied again and again and again. I've published multiple studies on this subject. Other groups of scientists have looked at it carefully and published different studies on it. And what the overwhelming weight of science indicates is that forests that are dominated by snags, whether it's from drought and native bark beetles or whether it's from a high-intensity fire patch, the snags do not tend to make the fires burn more intensely. And so it's really, really just a misconception that dead trees and down logs are driving big fires and more intense fires. That's actually not happening. The snags don't really have a lot to carry flames, so bear in mind, what really burns, what can carry flames on a tree is the foliage. And after a tree dies, the foliage quickly and falls, and the small twigs fall and decay into soil within about 2 years. And so you just don't have much to carry flames. And that's not to say that it can't get burned. They will, if it's crown fire. But they don't really contribute much to fire intensity. But they're great wildlife habitat, and they're great carbon storage.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And just the follow-up comment by that questioner, which salvage logging seems too prevalent and partly based on fear or fuel load. This evaluation begs the question, why are we doing this in the first place?
Well, good
kind of
question.
Answered that already.
Yeah, good question and well stated. And I guess the answer is we shouldn't be. And it's about the money, and it's a corrupt system that needs to change. We need to get the Forest Service out of the logging business.
Sounds like a great idea. What impact do low intensity fires have on mature sequoia forests, not necessarily old growth?
Yeah. So low intensity fires, just they're a natural part of the mix. Natural fire regimes in these sequoia groves are a mix of low, moderate, and high intensity fire. So low intensity surface fire is a natural part of it, but it really doesn't change the ecosystem much. Low intensity fire will certainly consume a small portion of the duff and litter. Not most of it, but it will consume a small portion. It'll kill some seedlings and some saplings, mostly of non-sequoias. But it will kill some sequoia seedlings and saplings too, and especially if they're not very big. And it will, basically scorch the base of some of the mature trees. But there's almost no mortality of mature trees in low intensity fire areas. But also, by several years post-fire, almost no reproduction. It gets pretty close to zero by several years post-fire. Now, you can come into, and I've done this numerous times, a low-intensity fire area 1 year after a fire. And, sometimes you'll see like 10,000 seedlings per acre, 20,000. And you think, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Look at all this reproduction. Come back in 3 or 4 years and you may not see any.
Okay, thank you. So what do we feel have we learned anything from other countries about the regrowth after high intensity fires in other parts of the world?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is, as I mentioned, the giant sequoia is a serotinous species, and there are hundreds of serotinous tree species around the world, many of them conifer, but also non-conifers as well. And so, of course, in these ecosystems, you get tremendous, abundant regeneration typically after high intensity fire. But there are also a lot of non-serotinous tree species that also regenerate abundantly after fire. Some of them by sprouting from the base, some of them from seed, and that are carried by wind and by birds, small mammals. And so, different trees have different evolutionary strategies, so to speak. And some of them reproduce just wonderfully after high intensity fire, and they're not serotinous. And so what we're seeing is a broad pattern that in fire adapted forest ecosystems, forests regenerate just great after high intensity fire patches. This is a broad global rule. If you look hard enough, you can find what at least appears to be an exception at a very, very local scale, but these are very much exceptions to the rule. And I will tell you that as a field ecologist who's first and foremost a boots on the ground guy gathering field data, I've been focusing my field research in these high intensity fire patches for over 2 decades. And I have not found a single area of any ecologically meaningful spatial scale where the forest is not regenerating after high intensity fire. So this whole notion that we just keep getting bombarded with in the press, all coming from the logging industry and U.S. Land agencies involved in logging, claiming that high intensity fire is causing conversion to non-forest, using really inflammatory terms like zombie forests. That's mythology. I've yet to find any meaningful spatial scale where that's true in the field, especially if you take into account time since fire, because the regeneration doesn't always happen in year 1 or year 2 post-fire. I know a number of places where it's abundant in year 1 post-fire, and some places where it starts in year 8 or 9 post-fire. Usually it's somewhere in between.
Okay. How can we present overwhelming evidence to the U.S. Forest Service to steer them to revising these policies?
Yeah, great question. Well, the evidence is already tremendous and substantial. And, in my book, Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate, I wrote this for non-scientists, but I wanted to make sure that that readers had the information and the citations and the tools they needed if they wanted to push back on agency managers and policymakers who are doing the wrong thing. So I have literally hundreds of scientific studies cited in the endnotes of my book, Smokescreen. I also have put together numerous fact sheets with citations on these various issues. And I'm happy to send those fact sheets to anyone who's interested. Feel free to just send me an email and I'll follow up. It's cthanson1@gmail.com. And that's C as in Chad, T as in Tom, HANSON, and then the number 1 at Gmail.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. You may get inundated, would be my guess, but I know how good you are at responding to questions. So.
I try.
Yes, and I always appreciate it when you do. What path forward do you see for countering the disinformation which the Forest Service and the timber prescribed burn industries use to fool the public as they distort facts and defy logic to get the cutout?
Yeah, I think that we need to turn up the volume on the public dialogue. The agencies need to be held accountable, and policymakers, elected officials, need to be held accountable much more and much more broadly. I think we can do a lot of this through grassroots means. There are a number of folks on this call, and some folks who were not able to attend tonight, who have done just a tremendous job of generating letters to the editor, to newspapers in California and across the West, and in some cases in national news outlets, when this misinformation is included in news stories, and especially if it's not rebutted by counter quotes, which is sometimes the case, unfortunately, as well as opinion editorial articles. Those are two things that are neither one costs any money. It's just a little bit of time and effort. And, I think this is something that the Sierra Club is just really, really good at and has done for a long time, better than any other organization, arguably, on things like this, kind of like grassroots media and organizing. And so I think we need a lot more of that. And I think also just more grassroots meetings with policymakers and their staff to tell them to change direction on these management regimes.
Yeah. Kind of always ultimately boils down to politics. So the same questioner asked, why do big green environmental groups such as the Sierra Club and the Nature Conservancy support this deception? What is the National Sierra Club policy concerning commercial logging on public land, which flies in the face of ever-evolving current science?
Yeah, so I'm happy to say that the Sierra Club supports and has for a long time, and advocates for full protection for federal public lands from logging, getting the federal land agencies out of the commercial logging business. And so that is Sierra Club policy, which is great. I'm also happy to report that the Sierra Club has supported joined with a number of other grassroots groups and litigating this Nelder Grove logging project. So Sierra Club has done the right thing and has stepped up, and I think deserves a lot of credit for doing that, because there are a lot of organizations that either don't want to delve into it, or they think the politics is too confusing, or they see some Democrats who are signed on as co-sponsors of the Save Our Sequoias Act logging bill, and maybe they don't want to offend some of their political allies. we need to hold politicians accountable regardless of their party when they're doing the wrong thing. And so Sierra Club has done that, has stepped up and has joined the lawsuit on the against the Nelder Grove logging project. And so I think that that's really great, and Sierra Club should be commended. Nature Conservancy is a very different story. They are promoting logging in many different ways, very destructive logging, and are actually conducting logging operations on their so-called nature preserves. In many cases, areas, some of the preserves that are forested, they're doing logging operations and calling it restoration and reforestation and fuel reduction, just like the Forest Service does. So I think that there are many, many organizations that are deeply concerned about the Nature Conservancy and its policies at this point. I would not put the Sierra Club in the same sentence with the Nature Conservancy at all.
Yeah, I just want to say, Chad, we actually, Karen got the word today from people in the know that Save the Sequoias looks to be all but dead with McCarthy gone. So that's something that I think we all on this call can uniformly celebrate.
Absolutely.
For
We
now.
should celebrate that. And also everyone should just pat themselves on the back who participated, because that didn't happen by accident. You know, I'm a cautious guy when it comes to stuff like this, because you know, I've been doing this for about 35 years, forest protection work, and I've seen a number of circumstances where a very dangerous logging bill was viewed as almost dead, and turned out that it wasn't quite dead and came back and actually became law. So I'm always I keep pushing and I keep pushing. I keep up the pressure until it's truly dead.
Good
I want
message.
to say, and I want to say something about that. I got an email today from somebody in the Sierra Club from National, which and what she said is, although it seems to be dead with Kevin McCarthy leaving, there is some danger still that it might get tagged on to agricultural appropriations or something. And so she suggested that if you are meeting with any of these representatives, and I'm going to put a link in chat, it would be really good to mention that we don't want logging in the Sierras. We don't want this bill, I mean, in the Sequoias, and we don't want this bill to be added onto something else. So I'm going to put a link in chat. If you decide to do this, you could contact me and we can help you with the talking points.
Thank you. Yeah, really, really great point. And sometimes, by the way, a logging bill can be dead in a given congressional session. But if you let off the pressure and you don't follow up, it can come back again in the next congressional session. So I think the opportunity here is to prevent that from happening. And I think we have a good opportunity because the momentum's on our side now.
So take home point is celebrate, but then get back to work.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so moving on to some more questions. What changes in damage and recovery from Sequoia forest fires have you seen in response to California's droughts and higher temperatures?
Yeah, well, can you repeat the question? I want to make sure I get this right.
Sure. What changes in damage and recovery from Sequoia forest fires have you seen in response to California's droughts and higher temperatures?
Yeah. Okay. I think I understand the question. So basically, what's the influence of you know, drought and you know, particularly hot summers on Sequoia fires and regeneration? And basically, what we're seeing is in most years there just aren't fires in the Sequoia groves, but in some years there are. And if you have a really big, if you have a drought year, and you have particularly hot, dry, windy conditions and an ignition, like from lightning, then you're going to have a fire, and it's oftentimes going to be a larger fire. And those conditions, that convergence of conditions, you know, is something that happens periodically and has for you know, countless millennia. And so for me, the question is, do we have too much fire? Do we have too little fire? And what's going on in terms of reproduction? Because you know, no fire years, light fire years, that's natural. And so are big fire years. Those are all natural. 2020 and 2021 are both drought years, both big fire years. From lightning strikes, again, these are natural lightning fires. And what we're seeing, and also, you know, 2022 was also a drought year, but we didn't have any significant amount of fire in the Sequoia grove. So just because you have a drought year doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a bunch of fire in Sequoia groves, but it could. Now, of course, 94% of Sequoia Grove area has burned in recent years. And so there's not much potential for fire in the coming years for quite a while, just because, fire has a suppressing effect on the next fire for a certain number of years. But what we're seeing is tremendous regeneration, even during drought years. We're seeing amazing sequoia regeneration in these high intensity fire patches. It's more in some years, not quite as much in other years. But what we're not seeing is a lack of regeneration anywhere. And this is a crossroads. We're in high intensity fire patches, numerous different groves, and we're seeing a consistent pattern of amazing regeneration of sequoias in these high intensity fire patches. It happens in wet years even more, but it also happens in drought years. Of course, not every year is a drought year, right? You can get some back-to-back drought years, but you're always going to get some wet years sprinkled in there too.
Hey, and I don't know if this is referring to, say, the sequoias. One questioner asked, presumably the fire intensity and logging bill applies to coastal redwoods?
No, this is the so-called Save Our Sequoias Act pertains to giant sequoias in the Sierra Nevada. It does not pertain to coast redwoods.
Okay. Can you speak to the fact that different cone species possess different serrating profiles, such as temperature required to release cone seeds? And the follow-up on that was also, how do sequoia cones compare to other conifers like ponderosa and lodgepole in terms of serrating?
Serotiny, yeah. So, ponderosa pines are not serotinous. Lodgepole pines in the Sierra Nevada are not serotinous. Rocky Mountain lodgepole is serotinous, and so it just depends. So the non-serotinous conifers, they don't need intense fire to release seeds from their cones. There's lots of ways that seeds get released from their cones all the time. And also ways that their seeds get distributed all around the forest, really at any distance into a high intensity fire patch, by wind, by birds and small mammals. And so they all regenerate really nicely after high intensity fire. But what you do see, though, that's different with serotinous species like the giant sequoia, but like other serotinous tree species around the world and in North America, what you see is a tremendous abundance of regeneration of seedlings and saplings, and a tremendous growth of those seedlings and saplings after high intensity fire, in particular, in ways that is very, very unusual with non-serotinous species.
Okay, and can you predict the outcome of the Biden administration's calls to the U.S. Forest Service to rewrite forest management and plans for old growth forests?
Yeah, good question. Well, first off, it's really, really wonderful and encouraging that an administration is talking about the importance of mature and old growth forests for biodiversity and for climate change mitigation and carbon storage. So just to say that from the outset. Having said that, what the Biden administration has proposed is too limited. They narrowed their proposal to old growth forests, so they left out mature forests, which is actually most of the mature and old growth category. And they included a logging loophole in old growth forests to say, well, they can log as long as they don't say they're logging mostly for the money. They can just say with a wink and a nod, they're doing it for forest health or fuel reduction. And that's what most logging projects in old growth forests already are. That's the way they're spun already right now by the Forest Service. And so I think there's a concern there that logging loophole needs to be eliminated, needs to be closed, and the administration needs to include mature forests and not just old growth forests. They also need to make sure that the areas that they designate as protected stay protected after natural processes occur in the future, like the next fire, that doesn't somehow open the door to logging on the back end, post-fire clear cutting, for example. So there are some things that need to be done to strengthen this proposal, to make it real. So it's not just illusory. And one of the things that's key too is that the administration has proposed to amend all the forest plans in the country to include whatever protections they ultimately issue. But the thing is that there's no protections of any meaningful type on most national forests now. And there's no possibility for the Forest Service to amend all their forest plans before the November presidential election. So this would all happen after the election. Now, of course, Joe Biden may or may not get elected. He may or may not be the nominee. We just don't know. And so there's no guarantees. What Joe Biden could do, and he could do this tomorrow morning, he could wake up in the morning and he could issue an executive order that puts a moratorium, a halt on logging in mature and old growth forests that they inventoried, the tens of millions of acres that they inventoried on public lands. They could put a moratorium on that and halt it, regardless of the stated or claimed purpose. And so no logging loopholes. If the Forest Service claims with a wink and a nod, they're doing it for fire management or forest health or restoration or any of the other logging euphemisms. Joe Biden could do that tomorrow. And I think that we need to put pressure on the administration to do that. Right now, there's a letter circulating from a number of environmental NGOs, including my organization, the John Muir Project. We're playing a leading role in this, asking the administration to do just that. And so that whatever happens on the back end after the election, that there are protections in place for these forests. And so that we don't see the Forest Service just ramping up logging projects to log the last best mature and old growth forest before, they're basically, the chainsaws and bulldozers are kept out of those areas. And right now we're seeing some really big logging proposals after the Biden administration signaled their intention to protect mature and old growth forests. So, we think this is important. And so on the one hand, the administration needs to be commended. On the other hand, the administration needs to be, we need some friendly pressure on the administration to actually enact meaningful protections in here and now in the interim.
Can you do you think you understand why the Biden administration kind of isn't willing to do that now? What are the forces working against that, political forces working against that?
Yeah, it's just lobbying pressure from the logging industry. That's plain and simple, directly and also indirectly through various members of Congress, Democrats in the House, in the Senate, who get a lot of campaign contributions from the logging industry, and then put pressure on the administration to either not do, to narrow the scope of the proposal, to include these logging loopholes. They want business as usual. But what we cannot afford is a situation where we give the administration political credit for protecting old growth forests or mature and old growth forests, when in fact that's not what's really happened. And so we need to make sure it's real. That's the main thing. It has to be real. No one gets credit for doing something that's not real.
Can you name some laws that you think absolutely need to be repealed to provide better protections for our forest lands?
Yeah, I don't see it as much as an issue of repealing, because there's so many laws over the decades that allow or encourage logging in one form or another on public lands and on private lands. To me, it's really an issue of just an overlay on existing laws that just says, look, whatever came before, here's what we're doing now. We are not doing logging we're not selling timber anymore, regardless of the claimed reason for it. We're not selling timber from public lands anymore to logging companies. Forest Service is not in the logging business. BLM is not in the logging business. The National Park Service is not in the commercial logging business, which, by the way, we're seeing some commercial logging projects on national park lands now as well. And so that's dangerous. So, that's what we need, but there's lots of different ways to get at that. One, of course, ultimately, we're going to need legislation, to be introduced and to pass to do that. But there's lots of things that can be done in the meantime. One of them is something, again, that Joe Biden could do by executive order, all on his own, and that is, a moratorium halting logging, including, thinning, which is another euphemism for logging, in mature and old growth forests.
How well did, getting away from the political sphere for now, how well do tree plantations grow after high intensity fire?
Tree plantations or just natural regeneration. I mean, natural regeneration grows amazingly well. It's variable. Some places it's a little bit more open. Some places it starts a little bit later, several years post-fire, and then it picks up and accelerates. Some places it starts 1 year post-fire and is abundant initially and then just keeps going. So we see all kinds of different patterns, and all of that's natural. It's part of the heterogeneity in nature and natural succession. Tree plantations, it's oftentimes a different story. I mean, you can certainly find tree plantations where, they're growing, even after clear cutting, it's not like tree plantations don't grow. But what you often see as well is areas where, for example, post-fire logging occurs and the logging machinery comes in, it rolls over and crushes and kills almost all the natural seedlings and saplings. And it does so much soil damage that when they come in and they plant their tree plantations, a lot of it dies. In many cases, most of it dies. And then they'll spray more herbicides and plant again, and most of it dies a second time. And then they come in again. We're seeing places in these post-fire logged areas, in some cases, this is not happening in all cases, but it's happening in a significant amount of cases. We're seeing places where they're on their third round of herbicide spraying and planting after post-fire logging because they keep getting failure in their plantings. And it's also simple things like that a lot of foresters don't think about, like microsite genetic variation. In natural regeneration, you have the actual natural fine scale genetic diversity that's adapted to that particular site over countless cycles of high intensity fire and regeneration going back thousands and thousands of years. Whereas with the plantings, these are it's the same species, but it doesn't have that microsite genetic variation that's adapted to that particular location. It's not the same.
Okay, and a related question, why do you think there's not more concern about the use of herbicides in vegetation management?
I think there's a lot of concern. I think that there's a lot of concern among people who know about it. I think that there needs to be a lot more daylighting of the fact that on public lands, especially national forests, but not limited to national forests, that logging and herbicide spraying are far more common and prevalent than most people realize. A lot of people don't even realize that it happens on public forests. So we just need more public education on that.
Okay. So do you believe that climate change is challenging forests to survive fires? So I guess causing them to rephrase it, causing them to adapt, as some say, in order to survive.
Yeah, forests, this is evolution in process. Forests adapt all the time. The big threat of climate change to forests is not wildfire. The big threat is just rising temperatures because, and also, just worsening drought cycles and just climate disruption. Disruption of patterns of precipitation. That's the big threat to forest ecosystems because as temperature continues to rise, if we don't get a handle on climate change, get away from fossil fuel burning, and protect a lot more forests, which are the two things we have to do to overcome the climate crisis. If we don't do that, and temperature and CO2 and concentrations keep going up in the atmosphere, temperature keeps rising. At the lower elevation, ecotone of some of these forest types, it will become inhospitable for that forest type to simply exist there at all, as a function of the temperature and the climate that's been created artificially by human-caused climate change. But it won't be because of fire, most likely. What I'm seeing is very, very different than what we're hearing in the public dialogue. What we hear in the press all the time is a conflation of climate change and fire. Well, certainly climate change influences fire, but they're not the same thing, and they don't have the same effect on the ecosystem. What I'm seeing is that these fires, including the high-intensity fire patches, are rejuvenating these forests. If anything, they're giving the forest greater resilience in the face of climate change. But if we don't turn the corner on this in the coming years and short number of decades on the climate crisis, we're going to see more and more impacts. We're already seeing the impacts, but we're going to see more and more impacts that we simply can't prevent. And so we're going to have to change. We're going to have to.
Why do sequoia seeds sprout after low intensity fire when most of them won't mature?
Yeah, I mean, it's a you can think of it as a kind of a bet hedge. It's the best conditions are high intensity fire for sure, because you have the three things you need for sequoia seedlings to germinate, to establish, to grow, and thrive over time and become mature. In low intensity fire areas, you just don't have those same conditions. But at the upper end of low intensity, the lower end of moderate intensity, you're going to get seed release. You're going to get some tree mortality of the canopy. So you may get little gaps in, little bits of additional sunlight. You're not going to get 100% consumption of the duff and litter, but you might get 50%. And so you don't have great conditions, but you have conditions that are enough in some cases to allow some reproduction. It won't grow very fast. It won't have very high survival, but it'll be there. And so it's better than nothing. Bear in mind, and it makes sense too, because again, these are mixed intensity fire regimes, low intensity, moderate intensity, and high intensity, all natural. And but you might have 10 low intensity fire cycles before you have the next high intensity fire happen. Low intensity fire might happen on an interval of 25 years on average, maybe 8 years, maybe 42 years, but it's going to happen on these cycles that are more frequent. High intensity fire is going to happen naturally every 300, 400 years, maybe 500 years on any given acre. And so in any given acre, on any given stand, high intensity fire is much less frequent. And that's the case now too. And so from the, if you think, from the standpoint of the sequoia, you don't want to forego reproduction completely for 300 years, 400 years. You want to see if you can get some. And so especially when you've got fire that's more in the moderate realm and or on the cusp of low and moderate, you actually can get some decent reproduction there. It won't grow as fast, it won't survive as well, but it can definitely happen. At the low end of low intensity, you basically don't even get seed release most cases.
Okay. And jumping back to politics question, and the question is it likely to be included in the Farm Bill? And I assume that person is asking about Save the Sequoias.
Oh, I think at this point, I hope it's unlikely. I think that most folks on Capitol Hill perceive it as being unlikely to be included in the Farm Bill at this point. But I also see it as a matter of conditional probability. I think they're assuming it's unlikely because there's growing opposition to the Save Our Sequoias Act, this logging bill, this deceptive, dishonest logging bill. There's growing awareness of what so-called restoration and reforestation and fire management really means as it's being operationalized by these land management agencies. And so it's because of that it's seen as unlikely at this point. If everyone just sort of went away and stopped talking about it and stopped pushing back on it and there was no pressure, I think that political calculus potentially changes and maybe unlikely becomes, who knows? And I don't want that situation. I think that's dangerous. And so that's why I say we need to keep up the pressure and just make sure that we have more and more commitments from our allies on Capitol Hill to oppose any attempt to include it in the Farm Bill, in appropriations, in an outdoor package, whatever it might be.
Great. Okay, do you think a moratorium on logging roads on public lands would be a good strategy to avoid damage to undamaged forests?
Well, I think a moratorium on logging roads is a great idea. We also need a moratorium on logging in mature and old forests, but and including a moratorium on post-fire logging when it occurs in mature and old forests. When fire occurs in mature and old forests. But certainly a moratorium on logging roads would be useful, helpful. that would be wonderful. But the one thing I would say is that there's so many logging roads from past timber sales on the national forests that the Forest Service can do an enormous amount of logging with existing logging roads without creating new ones. And so we're seeing in many cases huge logging projects where there's little or no new logging road construction. And so to me, yeah, I don't want to see new logging roads, but I also want to see existing logging roads closed, decommissioned, or at least indefinitely converted to what we call level 1 maintenance status, which means there are gates put across them, and you can hike, you can mountain bike, but you can't drive on those roads.
So we have a Midwesterner in our audience, and he asks, well, he prefaces this question to let you know that on the Shawnee National Forest in Southern Illinois, we have a proposal to divert land managers away from industrial forestry management. Have you heard of the campaign to establish the Shawnee National Park and Climate Preserve? And if so, do you or the Sierra Club have an opinion on this initiative? And I think there was a follow-up comment by somebody who's involved with National Wildlands indicating that, yes, we are in favor of this and working to support it. Do you have anything in addition to add?
I agree. I'm aware of it and I support it, and I'll do anything I can to help.
Okay. Can anything regarding high intensity fires be applied to other forest types?
So can you repeat that?
Is the equivalent research to this? I'm sorry. Can anything regarding high intensity fires be applied to other forest types?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It's interesting, fire adapted forests all across the globe. There's different fire regimes and different forest types. Not every fire regime is the same. But it's very, very uncommon to find a fire regime that's homogeneous. It's typically a spectrum, somewhere on the spectrum. It may be heavily weighted towards high intensity fire in a particular forest type, but there's going to be some low and moderate, or it's heavily weighted towards low and moderate, but there's going to be some high intensity. And so what we find in the ecological literature is that in mixed intensity fire regimes, where there's any significant component of one or the other, that high intensity fire is a natural component in those systems, whether it's naturally mostly high intensity or it's naturally 20% high intensity or 15%. That those systems are highly adapted to high intensity fire. They regenerate nicely, and they typically have plant and animal communities that have evolved to depend specifically on the high intensity fire component that creates what we call complex early seral forest habitat, also known more colloquially as snag forest habitat. We see these associations in different forest types in different regions. There was just a really cool study that came out regarding a 2016, I believe it was a 2016 fire in Great Smoky Mountains National Park in the Southern Appalachians. And, we haven't really been, I think most Americans haven't been thinking about fires in, Great Smoky Mountains National Park or in the Southern Appalachians in general, or the Appalachian Mountains at all. But we've had a number of fires in recent years, many of them from lightning strikes that have burned, and some of it's been low intensity, some's been moderate, and some has been high intensity fire patches. Well, some researchers looked at bird abundance and diversity, and they actually found that the highest levels of bird diversity were in the high intensity fire patches. And so it's interesting because they're finding things that are similar to what we're finding in a lot of the Western forests, even though the forest type is very different and the fire regime isn't exactly the same. It's markedly different, but not completely different. And so it's important. And we're seeing this on other continents as well. There's a lot of really cool research coming out of southeastern Australia and eucalypt forests that have a mixed intensity fire regime. there. So yeah, these are broad principles. Forests of Western and Central Europe, similar things are emerging.
Okay, and I do want to respect your time. We're at 5:15, so I don't want to push your goodwill too far. Can you answer two more questions?
Sure, let's take two more and
Okay.
then we'll call it a night.
Okay, and one is actually my question, and it has to do with the conversation we had at a few of us attended the Democratic Convention recently to pass out flyers and talk to people about things like Save the Sequoias. And we engaged in a conversation with a Park Service employee from Sequoia National Park, who made the statement that, basically humans got us in this mess, so we have to fix it.
Yeah.
And she also kind of talked about the scorched earth philosophy that, high intensity fire renders the soil way too damaged to harbor any life. And that's why we have to go in and do this replanting.
Well, I suspect I know who this individual is because this particular individual has said almost exactly the same thing to me. And they know that it's not true because we've actually been in the field together and hiked through the high intensity fire patch and seeing the amazing amounts of giant sequoia regeneration and regeneration of other native plants that are so abundant that it's hard to walk through them. And so this idea that if high intensity fire occurs, it sterilizes the soil and nothing will grow, pure mythology. She knows that. She's seen it with me. And this notion that, well, we created this problem and so we have to fix it. Well, that's very self-serving. It's also dishonest. We've looked at this very, very carefully. There is no statistically significant relationship with long unburned status or time since fire and fire severity, except in the very, very, like if a fire burns, 5 years earlier, yeah, it's going to influence fire severity for a brief period of time. But after a very short period of time, it basically just goes back to baseline conditions. Doesn't matter if it hasn't burned in 25 years, 50 years, or 120 years. We looked at the areas that hadn't burned in more than a century, where we had successfully suppressed wildfires in these groves for more than a century, no fire at all. They didn't burn any more intensely than areas that burned in like 25 years post-fire. And so that whole notion is not backed up by the evidence, and it's also, again, it's very self-serving. And I think that there's different motives operating there. Potentially, I'd like to think that that's not the case, but I've gone down this road with the evidence with some of these folks again and again. They keep saying the same things to people. I also know that this particular group of Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park employees took a reporter into this one little area at the edge of the big high intensity fire patch, where if you stand there, you can't see any sequoia seedlings. If you stand in this one particular area, it's the only place I know of out of about 450 acres. It's the only place I know of where you can stand in one place and you can't see any. And of course, there is regeneration there. It's just, about 40 per acre, and they're kind of behind shrubs and growing between shrubs. They're actually growing really nicely and surviving really high levels. Nothing wrong with 40 per acre if they're surviving at high levels and growing nicely. But if you go there and someone tells you, oh, this is what it looks like in the high intensity fire patch, soil was destroyed and there's no sequoia regeneration, and this is what it looks like, people get misled. And this reporter was misled and wrote an article about it saying that. And it was, I would actually say it's propaganda, straight up.
Okay. Fine. And this was actually the first question that came in for your talk, but the questioner retracted it later, saying it wasn't strictly having to do with sequoias, but
okay.
But it's still kind of an interesting question, and I know you enough to know that you are happy to talk about it having anything to do with
All right.
forests
Sure.
and wildfires. Okay, so how do we determine what is the appropriate amount of fire on the landscape in the current climate conditions, and what is too much, especially when the Forest Service is expanding it and igniting so many fire on landscape in the course of fire management activities, sometimes miles from a wildfire.
Yep.
I realize it depends on the type of ecosystem, but generally, is there any way to know what is too much fire now? I would say in New Mexico, we have had too much fire, and it was mostly at the hands of the Forest Service one way or another.
Yeah. Well, this is a really good question. Fire is natural in these ecosystems, but you don't want to have too much. You don't want to have too little. Either one of those things can be a problem. Right now in forest ecosystems in this country, generally we have too little. However, what I am seeing is certain places where land managers are deliberately applying fire at a unnatural hyperfrequency. And they're trying to do this as a sort of wildfire suppression strategy. The thinking is, if we just hit the area with fire again and again and again and again, prescribed burning particularly, that somehow will prevent a wildfire from ever occurring. Well, that's not the way it works. A wildfire can occur 1 year after a prescribed fire. It'll spread right through that area. It's not going to stop typically. It can, but usually not. By 2 years, 3 years, it'll burn right through that area. By several years post-fire, you'll basically have the same kind of mix of intensities that you would have had if you hadn't done a prescribed fire. And so, these are forest types where naturally fire might have burned every 25 or 30 years on average, with varying cycles for thousands of years. And in some cases, we're seeing land managers trying to hit those areas with multiple prescribed fires every 2 or 3 years. And in many cases, what's happening is eventually you just increase your odds with that kind of unnatural hyperfrequency of escapes. And you've got hot, dry, windy conditions, and you get people who are starting fires when they shouldn't, and boom, you've got a big fire that is not what they intended, burns down some towns like we saw in New Mexico not long ago. And that's avoidable, so just because fire is a good thing doesn't mean that you can't have too much of a good thing if you throw too much money at land managers and you don't have any proper oversight over what they're doing. And so I am seeing some places where their land managers are applying fire much too frequently in some of the forests in the Midwest and in some of the forests in the Southeast, like in Texas. And also in some places in New Mexico. I think there's also a concern that they're starting to try to do that in some of the sequoia groves in the Sierra Nevada their attempt to exclude high intensity fire patches to try to just keep doing frequent low intensity fire in ways that are completely unnatural and evolutionarily unprecedented. And there's all kinds of negative unintended effects that can come from that. So yeah, we have good information in the scientific literature about the natural rates of low intensity fire, of high intensity fire, the natural range of variability, because it's not like it happens like clockwork every 20 years or 40 years or 300 years. There's a range, and that range is natural. And so we actually have good information on that. We just need to use that as our benchmark and hold land managers accountable if they either suppress fire so much that we have too little, or they get out there with their drip torches too much and accelerants and just start lighting up the landscape more than it's evolved to handle.
Okay, I don't want to push the envelope here. I know we do need to wrap things up, but Kristen Lee has one important concern, and maybe we could
Sure.
get your thoughts.
Do one more.
Is somebody
Thank you
on?
so much.
Yeah, on the National Sierra Club. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Chad. A couple of people raised the question of what do they do if a local Sierra Club chapter promotes logging in contradiction to national policy?
Yeah, this is a something that's come up now and again in various places in the country over the years, and it's just important to be vigilant about this. People oftentimes they mean well, but they maybe don't have the best scientific information. Maybe they're not even aware of the National Sierra Club policies, and we have national policies on these things. So I think it's important, to have a friendly conversation with that individual or those individuals who are promoting those things. Ask them to get in line with National Sierra Club policy. If they won't do the right thing, run it up the flagpole. Bring it to the attention of the vice president for chapters and groups on the board. That's a special position on the board of directors now, and they're supposed to be involved in that sort of thing. Also, the vice president for conservation. So the two vice presidents are both supposed to be involved in upholding national policies. And the last thing I would say is, if you see that happening, get some buddies together who care about forests, who care about the science, who care about the integrity of Sierra Club's policies and positions, and run for chapter executive committee. Get involved. Run for group executive committee. Get involved and just make sure things are done right. So I always encourage people, instead of getting frustrated and walking away, to get involved.
Thank you so much, Chad, for going the extra mile with us here to try to get all these questions answered. If I missed any questions, again, Chad has indicated he'd be happy to respond to you that in a direct email. So, and my final comment to you, Chad, is don't retire. We need you.
I have no intention of ever retiring. Thank you.
Good, great. And Karen, did you want to say something about next month's presenter?
I wanted to say a couple things. So Chad, thank you again for coming and talking to us. It was a great pleasure. And would it be okay if we posted your slides in addition to the recording on our website?
Absolutely. Please do.
And maybe you could send me the slides, because I don't have them yet.
Yeah. Just send me an email message and remind me, and I'll send it along.
Okay, great. And Karen Yarnell, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and I've heard Chad talk about this before, the prescribed burning policy. We're going to have a program on that on our Wild Activist Call the 3rd Thursday of February. I'll be sending notices about that.
Thanks for mentioning that. And Sierra Club actually has a pretty well-informed new policy on prescribed fire that says that it's not a substitute for natural mixed intensity wildfires. It can have a time and place, but it needs to be within the natural range of variability. We need to take into account community safety, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a pretty thoughtful policy. A lot of input from groups and chapters across the country. I think the club did a good job on this. I was involved in it as well.
So next month on February 26th, it's the 4th Monday, we're going to have Ethan Iritunian speak. I think I probably didn't say his name right. He's from Northern California, the Mendocino area. He's going to talk about how he was able to defeat a timber harvest plan in California, Bootleg 2. So this is a rare event, and it's important to get tips from people who were successful. So
absolutely.
So thanks for coming, and we'll talk to you in about 5 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Sierra Club.